only I could make you see how even half my world appears to me. If I could only just describe precisely how my eyes send signals to my brain, then it would be plain how different my world is from yours. You see, the problem's not my eyes, it's the axons and the cells, the connecting bits inside. I may seem to have good sight, but deep within my skull, buried in this shell, is a mesh of lanes and lines, and there's something not quite right in the tangled strands of white, the stuff that's wrapped in myelin. Try smearing Vaseline on the centre of your specs. Now roll up a newspaper and notice the effect as you peer through the hole. What you see is imperfect. It's a narrow, murky world. Now try looking through one eye and cover up one side. Can you now understand what it's like to be a person with a sight impaired condition? And that's less than half my world, and it's still not what I see. Try blinking slowly, so half the world is dark and the other half is light. I'll tell you what it's like. Your sight becomes disjointed, your vision interrupted, things appear and disappear. You're missing half the world, so of course you're in a whirl. Wear sunglasses indoors and switch the house lights off. Watch how the room becomes confusing and obscure. Note how it makes you feel afraid and insecure. And that's still less than half my world, and it's still not what I see. Try out the SimSpecs, tunnel vision and RP, hemianopia and myopia. What exactly do you see? You see something that resembles what's happening to me, but it's still less than half my world, and it's still not what I see. It's hard to grasp, I know. It's still a mystery. I cannot see like you, and you cannot see like me. All I ask for, please, is a bowl of empathy. Just try to see the world as it is to me. Hello and welcome once again to my channel, A Child with Special Needs. My name is Maurice Sparrow, and today I'd like to start talking a little bit about cerebral visual impairment and be a bit more kind of precise about what it involves. It's a very difficult subject and a vast subject really, and in particular it's quite difficult to understand how someone else sees the world. I would find it really difficult to understand the way you see the world, but I make a big assumption. I assume that you see it exactly the same that I do, but that's not the case automatically with a person suffering from cerebral visual impairment. It was particularly interesting when I went to Scotland and observed the assessment by the eye doctor of the child, and he didn't just test visual acuity, he tested a range of things including field of vision and vision for movement, because all of these things are involved in cerebral visual impairment. It's very important that we do have a proper diagnosis of cerebral visual impairment, because then we can understand what the child sees, and we can adapt and modify their environment and their learning to suit them. So how do we understand cerebral visual impairment? The best way I found is by listening to people who can talk about it from personal experience, or from people who have studied it in quite a lot of detail. There was a case in the early 20th century which is particularly interesting in our understanding of cerebral visual impairment. There was a man called Gordon Holmes at the beginning of the 20th century, and one particular early research paper in 1918 is called Disturbances of Visual Orientation. He makes a detailed study of 6 soldiers who have all had bullet wounds to the back of the brain in the area, particular area that is related to vision, the parietal lobes and the superior occipital cortex. And their symptoms were very similar, and he described them in great detail. So I'm going to spend a bit of time today just talking about them, and hopefully we will learn something about what cerebral visual impairment is from these cases. Let me quote what he says. The most striking features were his inability to touch directly any object presented to him, and even to extend his hand in the right direction towards it, though he could recognise it, and his difficulty in fixing his eyes on anything held in front of him. When asked to look at the observer's face, he generally stared open-eyed in the wrong direction, saying, "Sometimes I can see it, sometimes I can't." He was frequently unable to move his eyes at will in any direction. They all were unable to find things in space and accurately reach and touch an object. The writer makes the point that this soldier had a complete lack of spatial awareness, and a further point that he made was that he suffered from simultanagnosia. This is the inability to perceive several things at once in front of him. Let me quote, "When he was asked to count coins or other objects in front of him, he usually started at any part, but soon became confused. He could, however, count them accurately if he was allowed to take each one in succession in his hand, one at a time. The failure in these simple tasks, when he was relying on vision only, was obvious due to his inability to localize things in space." Holmes summarized the symptoms that each of the soldiers had as follows. He said their central vision was intact. They all had difficulty fixing and following a moving object. They all were unable to find things in space and accurately reach and touch an object. They all had difficulty moving their eyes, and this created problems when they were trying to read because of their inability to fix and to follow a line of text. They also had difficulty moving about without bumping into things, so their spatial awareness was affected. They also had, each one of them, an impairment in their lower visual field, something called hemianopia, that is, they only saw half of the visual field. A similar group of symptoms had already been identified a few years before that by a Hungarian neurologist, a man called Balint. In 1909, he observed a combination of visual difficulties that seemed to occur together, similar to these soldiers. This combination of visual impairments was actually given the name BALINT'S SYNDROME, and it's a rare condition, but you do come across it. The symptoms are three in particular. Visual simultanagnosia, that is the inability to see the visual field as a whole, seeing only bits of objects, not seeing the whole thing, the inability to really see the whole scene at once. Ocular motor apraxia, the difficulty in moving or fixating the eyes, just like these soldiers had, difficulty in fixing and following, not being able to move the eyes at will. And then thirdly, optic ataxia, that's the inability to move the hand to an object by using vision to guide the hand, visually guided movement. I've seen each of these symptoms at one time or another. Simultanagnosia is probably the commonest one I've come across. The inability to see the whole visual scene at once. Problems that children have in particular with clutter and crowding is quite common with CVI. Ocular motor apraxia, the inability to fix or move the eyes, is also something I've seen very often. and optic ataxia, visually guided reaching. That's also a common thing. And if these three things occur together, it is given the name BALINT'S syndrome. I remember seeing a video of BALINT'S syndrome being demonstrated. In this video, a man was presented with a spoon, and he says he can see it, he can identify it and say what it is, but he can't tell precisely where it is in space. He tries to grasp it, but he merely brushes his hand against it. So he's unable to use his vision to locate it with his hands. The psychologist in the video then moved the spoon about, and the man was then able to reach it and hold it quite well. So when it was moving, he had better vision than it was standing still. Then the man held up a comb, and the man said, "That's a comb." A spoon was held up in front of it, but the man still only saw the comb. He was only able to see the comb. So he was simultanagnosic. He could only see one of them. The psychologist then held the comb and spoon next to each other, but the man could not see the comb when the two were right next to each other. He was unable to see both objects at once. And finally, when asked what he can see, he says the board in the background with writing on it. His attention has now moved to the blackboard behind the objects against the wall, and now he can't see the spoon or the comb. So in that particular video that I saw, it was demonstrated very clearly that the man was unable to see more than one thing at once. When you see these things being demonstrated, it makes it much clearer. But if you bear in mind that many of the children we work with may have these symptoms and may not be diagnosed, and so if they're not diagnosed, then we can't help them. So how important is it that we get a diagnosis? It's very important to get a diagnosis. I'm going to leave today's session there. There's a lot to think about, but if you want to look those up, you can Google both of those names, BALINT and Gordon Holmes and BALINT'S syndrome. They're both very interesting cases, and you can learn a lot about them by studying them. Thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you again. Don't forget to subscribe if you can. You'll see the next video coming up if you do. Okay, bye now.